Laputa Castle in the Sky was the beginning of something special. A big Japanese animated feature created in-house, a film for children, just as Miyazaki thought it should be. It was high risk and high reward. If it didn't succeed, it would be all over before it even starts. They had an impossible task ahead of them, yet the director would repeat a single mantra throughout the production.
This film cannot fail. We cannot fail.
This is the birth of Studio Ghibli in a far-off neighborhood in West Tokyo. There was a rented building, described as a treasure box, new black desks, shiny floors, and some of the best animators in the industry, all in one place. These talents would set the foundations for years to come, with several of those young artists going on to create their own classics, like Nasu, Summer in Andalusia, directed by Ghibli's own Kitaro Kosaka, which happens to be the sponsor for today's video. Through Anime Go, the oldest anime distribution company still operating in America. They're giving Nasu its first English release. It's region-free and independent. Anime Go stands in the face of the massive consolidation of the industry. And that's how I like my anime sites. Old school. Nasu was also independently made of Ghibli, but predominantly by Ghibli talent. Slept on like no other. Like if you consider yourself a Ghibli fan, you owe yourself to check it out. It's scientifically proven 85% of you would adore it. And I'm not just saying that for the video because I've been a Nasu fan for years, and you can see that even on my channel. It's an underdog story that reflects director Kitaro Kosaka's rise, who was booted off Nausicaa for being a slacker, but over time, at Ghibli, went on to be one of their most established animation directors, and then a director himself, which is how he collected such a stacked group of animators. And I mean, it's a beautiful looking movie. Basically, what if Ghibli made a kinesthetic, crazy, cycling animation showcase? But if you want to directly support the channel, this is a really good way of doing that with my code STEVEM Nasu. That's my name and Nasu, hopefully that's easy to remember. And that is only for Media OCD's website, where you can get yourself a copy at 20% off. That's pretty good, but now that's only Nasu and only on Media OCD. Unfortunately, because of licensing, this title is only available in the North American region. You got $50 and then you got free shipping. So if you want to buy yourself a t-shirt or something, boom, even more money saved. Why not? But really, it's important to say, with Nasu, it can only really cycle because Laputa did the running. You've got talent on it, such as key animator Atsuko Atani was on both Nasu and Laputa. Laputa was her first movie at Ghibli, and she stayed there for the foreseeable future, becoming Ghibli's instructor, teaching all the new animators how to do the business. So it's not an exaggeration to say that she had a massive impact on Nasu, which involved basically teaching a majority of its animators. But let's actually look at the house she taught then. Let's go back to... The founding of Ghibli is a myth in itself, with varying versions depending on who you ask. Toshio Suzuki's version involved Takahata using up all the profits from Nausicaa during the making of his documentary, The Story of Yanagawa Canals. So Miyazaki had to pitch a new movie to avoid mortgaging out his house. Then boom, there's Laputa and a new studio. While in Takahata's version, it was a condition that he put upon the project. We proposed a new production studio, asking if Takuma Shoten has the view, but after this we are going to make real animation epics. Won't we not make it a nurturing place that is self-reliant? It would make more sense for them to have a production house, or they'd constantly be trying to find a new one for each of these movies. They already had several pitches looking for funding as it was, before even Castle in the Sky. None of them quite as desirable as Laputa though. It was greenlit in the spring of '85, with about a year to complete it, which would not be possible if it wasn't for Toru Hara, the founder of animation studio Topcraft, which produced Nausicaa. But let's make no mistake here, Topcraft is not Ghibli. Laputa was approved before Topcraft went bust. When Topcraft did go bust, Takahata and the producers had to keep going around the whole industry looking for somewhere else to make the animation studio, which eventually led to them making their own. While Topcraft made Nausicaa, it was chosen because it was the only studio with the resources and in-house facilities to complete it. Yet its rough schedule meant it was taped together with glue.
At the time of Nausicaa, there was a company called Topcraft, and it had a staff of more than 40 people. But this time we were searching for a location, gathering machinery, and gathering the staff. It was hard to create it from scratch because there was no organization. And I also did not know the temperaments of the gathered staff because this was my first time meeting them.
The hope with Ghibli is that they could create this perfect production method where they could come together and do things the way they want to instead of making another studio try and conform to their sort of rigid style. With a collection of talent that Miyazaki had worked at his prior studios, alongside a new fresh bunch of freelancers. However, at this time, Ghibli was a mercenary state that would completely dissolve if it was not producing movies, which put even more pressure on the staff. Miyazaki was going greyer by the day. It's lucky then they had Hara to help them across this, because without Hara, nothing would have got done. He's basically what you could call the real founder of Studio Ghibli, because he was invaluable in creating the earliest days of the studio. Oh wait, who's that knocking? Is that Toshio Suzuki? The man who tried to rewrite history to make him more important during the development and founding of Ghibli? Because while yes, Toshio Suzuki eventually does become the head producer at Ghibli, it is much later on in the 90s. At this point, he was still an editor at Animage and had very little experience in the producing world. Yet, in announcing the new studio, he wasn't even mentioned in his own magazine.
Takahata, Miyazaki, and Suzuki decided to continue making animated features. To do this, they needed a studio to work from. The name Ghibli was carefully chosen by Miyazaki himself.
Bro, I swear he put himself back in the picture. So let's peel back to Hara's involvement. If any staff in Topcraft return, it's because he phoned them himself and brought them on board. Like Kobayashi, the single key animator whose background was actually Topcraft. They were given the kids' reactions during making it to the castle in the sky. The emotion is pure and the movement is full of youthful energy. If you can say anything about Laputa, it's full of lively adventure. The film uses a head animation system, namely with Yoshinori Kaneda, and was the only Ghibli movie to ever use the structure. Heads were supposed to supervise smaller groups of animators and guide them. It made Kaneda a role model for younger animators, if he wasn't already. People inherently looked up to Kaneda, and they loved being around him because of his personality. Although the position on the feature came with a large responsibility. Much of the action was on his back, such as designing the movement of the flying vehicles, like the flappers. They flutter like horseflies, and it took an entire testing process to get the wing animation just right, from the pattern to how it looked when it was captured. But because of the technical difficulties, the final version used a form of dry brushing, showing the speed of its wings as smears. The next challenge became, how do you show such a little dynamic vehicle? It would be one thing if it just slid across the screen, but these things were dimensional. They broke through the shot in flowing chases that take expert use of perspective animation. The team put together some spectacular action from its opening moments. Laputa explodes onto the screen. Adventure through a perilous world. The danger is palpable as they walk a tightrope where it leaps between set pieces at rapid speed. It's hard to top Slagtown, not only because of Kaneda's cuts, but the group working under him. Kaneda was told to punch up Miyazaki's boards and bring out as much energy as he could. If they weren't funny, after all, it would be his fault.
I told Yoshinori Kaneda, the head key animator, to really go for it and not worry about the consequences. From the beginning, I never expected it to be a particularly persuasive scene.
Walking the line between playful and exciting. It has such momentum and spectacle, and the entire chase basically collapses upon itself. With so many drawings, it is hard to keep them all consistent. In the Ghibli method, that's the animation supervisor's job, usually referred to as the animation director elsewhere, checking and correcting to unify the style. Tsukasa Tanai, that's your guy, who had some experience on Miyazaki's prior classic serial works like Sherlock Hound, and was convinced, albeit strong-armed if anything, to join by Miyazaki, who questions his manhood on one hand and tried to ease him into the role with the other. Early on, when they had few staff collected, your boy here had to actually draw some stuff himself. Ghibli animation food looks so good, try Tanai food looks so good. He was responsible for this mine sequence, with a lot of excellent character acting here, not just in the presentation of the food, but also what it says about the different attitudes of Pazu and Shita. Let's take a quick break for a second to say thank you very much to Anime Go. If you want to get Nasu, you can use my code. But generally for the support of the entire channel, like, last couple of videos haven't performed the best, but really what keeps things going is people's likes, their comments, and their sharing of my content. So I've got to appreciate anyone who does that, and anyone who's willing to do it for this video, and most of all, the patrons. I mean, we can't do this without them. So let's give a big thank you to Lenny, Timmy J. Richards, Chunks, Fox Mulder, OT, Paul, Steven's Mum, Subsofa, Systematic, Karen, Doji, Peter, Jaeger, Big Boss, DTB, Gambaroni, Aleph, Mickey Moon, Petra Ferreira, Waj, RG Palmer, Kitty Cat, Oscar Brennan, Giorgio, Luga, Ian Laser, Curtis, Alexander, Pong, Mataisu, Axel, Sat. You're great, especially as well as the $5 patrons here. Thank you for keeping everything going and giving all the support you can. We'll be back to Oshi next time. Maybe the children do yearn for the mines. The animated setting took the staff to Britain, going all the way to the Welsh coal mines for research. This was just after the miner strikes of 1985, and their loss affected the idea of the picture, with the team wanting to capture a feeling of unity among the workers.
In Japan, the idea of workers with a true sense of solidarity, or local company housing for miners, is a thing of the past. But there are still places in Wales where this survives. But the realization that sort of thing still exists made us really want to go for it in the movie.
You see an act of resistance in protecting their own from tyranny. The class system in Laputa reflects upon the scale of the picture. The further you go up, the more divine and powerful the people, the more regal they become, which is exactly why this empire wants to obtain the castle's power, with only pirates intersecting between both realities. And because of them, you can see how the team wants to create a classic adventure movie. A treasure island in the sky, but for a modern audience. They didn't think they could sell a simple adaptation of Treasure Island anymore. It's not the 70s. European novel adaptations were all the rage in the anime industry during that period. Hell, even Toei had their own animal Treasure Island. Miyazaki was also in that one. But going into the 80s, these became less and less frequent as science fiction and other formats rose to predominance. Laputa is a byproduct of this era, as well as the lineage of Nausicaa, bringing those designs to something more 19th century akin to steampunk, while also still having things like ancient civilizations and world-ending weapons. It relates back to the Cold War struggles, with empires fighting for colonial control, next to this impending doom of nuclear weapons. And while that is there, the team were also doing their best to create a living world for this 2-hour run, with swashbuckling characters like Dolo running around, reminiscent of Miyazaki's character Kathy from Toei's Treasure Island, but now on the edge of retirement, just like the adventure genre itself. Much of the iconic designs and locations were built from the research of their Wales trip. The movie reflects the communal architecture of the mounding hills of the British countryside. There were only a small group of painters, and a mountain of backdrops to create. So the group had to take initiative, with the art directors ignoring some of the advice Miyazaki gave them, pushing the designs in ways that they had to just go with, including the slanted design in Slagtown, while also creating some of the nicest looking clouds you're ever going to see. You have to hand it to the art team, because the way they intersect with the photography department to mix tech and artistry is really something else. These movies' effects are relatively magical in how simple they can pull off an illusion. It's the charm of it all that it carries from its characters to its world, and even its score by Joe Hisashi. Producer Takahata invited Joe back for this movie, even if some of the other producers were unsure about doing that. Takahata thought it was the right decision. This time there is a mix of synthetic style next to a type of classic orchestra that Miyazaki movies would become famous for. The simplicity of its sparkling notes, almost like a music box, next to something that builds over time and becomes grand, with its own distinctive samples and a variety of musical styles that surely inspired all of your favorite JRPG soundtracks. It stands out as one of my favorites. And speaking of that Miyazaki movie format, when Disney redubbed Laputa in the late 90s, the entire soundtrack was recomposed with a full orchestra to give it a feeling closer to what would be a more contemporary Miyazaki movie at that point, even adding more music in comparison to the original's fairly sparse orchestration. They were trying to capture something that had been solidified in the Ghibli style. Many of those aspects were defined in Laputa, if not somewhat in Nausicaa as well. If it's the grassy fields, the beautiful skies, the colour direction of the veteran Yasuda, the sound of Joe Hisashi's orchestra. as well as the collection of really fantastic and punchy animation from a staff that has formed the language of Ghibli. Something that the marketers would have to take advantage of. Because back in 1985, Ghibli had no identity, no brand, no nothing, not even a logo. Its announcement was a footnote on the page of the movie. The studio had nothing to rely on at all. So the producer's approach took focus on Miyazaki as a director and hoped to make him a mainstream talent. By this point he was well known in animation circles, but not by the general public. Miyazaki's Laputa was unified tightly, especially in comparison to Nausicaa, which had a few animators that really burst out into the frame. Even someone like Yoshinori Kaneda, who is a legend in the action sphere, became harder to pick out scene to scene in Laputa. There's less individualism in each cut. Some might say one of the highlights of anime comes from the sake of each animator bringing their own specific style and vigour and leaving their own mark as part of a broader collective. But Miyazaki wanted his movies to reflect back to the manga movie era, where they were big, well-animated family entertainment, not works that appealed to otaku. Miyazaki's philosophy basically benefited the marketers, especially when they wanted to take it in that auteur angle. Now, auteurism was a theory created by some of the French New Wave in like French magazines back in the 50s. The basic tenet of it was the director was the author. It wasn't the screenwriter, wasn't the producers, it was the director. And through this mainstream film system, these directors could create personal art within a commercial system which was quite restrictive. During a period when directors were looked at as second-rate salary workers who were basically doing what they're told. Now, this was a hotly debated theory and is still to this day. There's a lot of criticisms you can make, but ironically, it was never really used for animation because I guess they saw animation as, well, it's made by hundreds of different people at the same time, so how could there possibly one vision? Which ironically, you could use as the exact same criticism against it in live action direction. It overemphasizes as one person when we're talking about an inherently collective medium which needs hundreds of people to even operate. The strength of cinema is such that, in the hands of a great director, even the most insignificant detective story can be transformed into a work of art. It has a lot of ego, a lot of aspiration in it, which also completely disvalues the idea of other people in the production helping or doing anything. Now, when we get back to Miyazaki, he wasn't exactly a big fan of the auteur system. In fact, he's made comments himself against that theory, because it does kind of contradict the process of which it takes to make an animated movie like this. Miyazaki literally doesn't have time to work with every little piece of it. He has to sort of designate different roles to different people, including stuff like having very little involvement in the music, or leaving the art directors to ultimately make the final decisions. But a soul figure is a lot easier to market, and people like Toshio Suzuki, they were a big fan of the auteur system, and they thought they could use this method to make Miyazaki famous, selling his name, because if you didn't have a studio, then they needed something, which created sort of mythologizing of Miyazaki as a director. So what does a real day-to-day look like at the studio? What does an animation director do? Well, if you ask production assistant Kihara, he'd tell you quite a lot of interesting stories. During the mid-80s, Miyazaki would come in most days and he'd work from 10 AM to 1 AM. He'd be chain smoking consistently while drawing up the storyboards, with the occasional meeting in the middle. And while Miyazaki wrote the script for Laputa, it was not used in full and the story began to change as the production went on. And because the storyboards weren't finished before production began, which is unusual, there's a good chance that if you didn't keep up, well, the entire thing could fall on its face and collapse. This is why the production desk is such a thankless job, because they're the person that needs to keep everything on schedule and keep an eye on how many cuts are done and what needs to be done, and where it needs to go and who it needs to be given to be corrected, if that's Tanai or Miyazaki. And we're talking 70,000 plus drawings that they need to keep on finish before the end of the movie. Tanai has talked about the process kind of going a bit like this, that Miyazaki's storyboard is basically the key first step, the springboard, and then when they get to the layout stage, it's checked and altered by the animation director or the director to make sure it's all cool, and then it gets moved into the next development side of doing the actual key animation, which is then checked again later on. There's a back and forth of adding and adjusting, relying on the staff to pull it through. There's also a benefit in having a studio like this where everyone is in-house for the most part. You basically can kind of go between departments and get things together and communicate and collab and bounce and get all your notes together. As the sort of production handler, you don't have to be running between different studios or going different places or calling people up. It can keep things very uniformed and tight, which is effectively the thing that probably got it through to that very near deadline at the end, is just how cohesive it is to have everyone working together as some of their parts. The demands were high of everyone, not only just of the animators, but of those production staff. Kihara once said that basically if you didn't have the entire production notes in your head, well, Miyazaki would say, you're pretty much useless. Like, what's the point? Like, anyone can look at a piece of paper. You needed to be on every single thing, which made it what could be considered a personal hell for the entire production, because those demands are just so insanely high that it was really hard to keep staff in the studio. And you can see the results in the attention to detail, from both the giant action set pieces to the most minute of motions. Big and small are treated with the same level of priority. And Tanai has talked about almost like the nuance of expression that could vary a lot between each scenes, and how that was challenging in its own right. There was no set faces. And the staff that were there were trying their best, because realistically, this might be the last time they could ever make a movie like this. And because of the reputation of Ghibli, you start to hear these sort of absurd little stories, almost like folklore, about be careful, in the middle of the night, Miyazaki might appear in your newly founded studio like a Gainax, and he'll try and recruit you and take you away. There are lots of little stories like that, like the time when the production assistant Kihara was going home and Miyazaki was following him in his car. He was going to thank him, but in this end, Kihara didn't want to hear any of that shit, so he basically started pelting it away, and Miyazaki started chasing him, and they basically created this insane chase sequence which would actually be in a Ghibli movie, and yes, this really did happen. Miyazaki's cult of personality became a factor in the marketing for Laputa. Even if they wanted to actually aim it at children, well, they don't have them as an audience yet, so they had to use that base, because without them, the film would not even make it that far. Laputa played alongside episodes of Sherlock Hound, and this was to attract people who already knew Miyazaki's successful works. When you look at the pages of Animage, which was the most popular animation magazine of that period, Laputa is caked all over it, and they were really bigging it up as what would be the biggest animation movie of that year. The method of selling Miyazaki for this film was not as successful as they liked, but it wasn't exactly a failure. It did sell 700,000 tickets at the cinema. It was a hit with these grown otaku types, and less so the children, unfortunately, but it's all about building an audience, and this film had a very passionate response. The people who did see it really loved it, and it started to create fans. Now, there weren't as many people watching it as, say, for example, as Nausicaa, who got 1 million ticket sales during its theatre run. But the marketing as a whole kind of made a few errors in terms of how it did stuff. Say, for example, in tie-ins, Laputa did have tie-ins, but Takahata didn't want them using any material from the film, actually from the film. He thought it would devalue the film to have, these characters in a, sugary drink advert. So he decided to say, no, you can't use anything from it. So in the end, these studios kind of got creative with it. It was like, okay, well, we're just going to make our own then. We're going to make our own live-action interpretation of Laputa. But at that point, it's so removed from Laputa and becomes its own kind of buzz that people don't even understand it's like connected to a film to begin with. It's just a cool, like, oh, look at that, cool flying machines. Laputa was also having issues with new technology. There was a lot of pressure to cut scenes from the Laserdisc and try and remove at least 4 minutes just so they could get it down, but in the end, they just couldn't do it. So they had to kind of bite the bullet and take on a much more expensive Laserdisc home release and hope it didn't affect them too poorly. Even if Laputa did sell less tickets than, say, Nausicaa, it actually sold more merch. It had a passion behind it, which led to a campaign to start rescreening it for families, which after the first year of the movie coming out, involved 70,000 screenings in Japan. Which, yeah, that is actually very impressive for a grassroots campaign. Alongside, after about 5 years, we had 80,000 home release sales, so Laserdisc I guess didn't matter too much in the end. And the film helped solidify the relationship between Nippon TV and Ghibli through their heads, Takuma Shoten. Now they owned Ghibli and they had a good relationship with Nippon TV, but they needed to show some, evidence of their performance. And Laputa has some pretty good ratings on television and has been shown on television over the last couple of decades more than a dozen times. Nippon TV became the only studio allowed to show Ghibli films, and then this led on to a point where a couple years ago, they even bought the studio. By the end of the 90s, we know that Laputa had sold about 186,000 videos at least, which is in the top 10 of animated movies in Japan at that point, at least in the Oricon scale. What's more, when it got to the States, we're seeing 1.5 million VHSs through Disney's home release. That's a big number. When it comes to the most beloved Ghibli films in Japan, the last time it was polled, Laputa was in the top 3 still. even with younger generations, as when it comes to Japanese Twitter, over the last decade plus, every time it's rebroadcast, it starts trending on the Japanese side of the site. In the end, its legacy preserved, but back in 1986, things were a little bit more turbulent for the studio because they didn't really know what their future was going to be and what was going to happen. Lucky, one of the assistants at the studio had an idea about selling cells, which nowadays, yeah, everyone does that, right? And it's almost a nightmare to try and get them because the scalper prices just increase. But back then, it was production waste, and they didn't really know if anyone would actually want to buy them. Like, they didn't really see the point. But it actually ended up being quite a good investment for them, and they got about 10 million yen, I think, just off selling the cells themselves, which probably covered some of the production cost and kept the studio going a little bit longer in between that sort of uncertain period before the studio would greenlight its next project, Totoro. With many of those core staff members developing their skills and going on to make many more projects at the studio and beyond, like Nasu in the Summer of Andalusia. Use my code to buy a copy. You know what to do. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.